I know this sounds cliche, but this really did happen to us on a dark and stormy night. My friend Alex and I were driving through a remote area of the mountains in Northern California on our way back from a music festival. Luckily for us, the rain didn't start until the festival was almost over. But now it was really coming down, and the windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. We had been driving for hours, and I was starting to feel tired, and Alex was asleep in the passenger seat. Suddenly, we hit a deep puddle of water, and the car sputtered and died. We barely had the momentum to steer it onto the side of the road. We tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. We were in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone coverage and no other cars in sight. We sat in the car and wondered what to do. We were a long way from any populated area, but figured that cell service might be available somewhere further down the road, and we could possibly go on foot until we found a signal. After 30 minutes of contemplating our next move, we heard a strange noise coming from the woods off to the side of the road. It sounded like footsteps and grunting, but I couldn't see anything out there in the dark. The noise grew louder and closer, and I can hear someone or something moving around behind the tree line. We felt a little panicked as we realized that we were definitely not alone. We locked the doors and windows, but the thing outside kept mulling around, and we still couldn't see anything. I frantically tried to start the engine, but it was still dead. The noises outside eventually stopped, and so did the rain. We sat there in silence, but I could hear the wheels spinning in Alex's head. We are both fairly big guys, and we suddenly mustered the courage to get out of the car and investigate, and to try to see if we could find an area with some cell coverage. We found nothing outside, and so we continued up the road for about 2 miles and hit a spot where we could make a call. We called AAA and gave them the location of where our car was stopped, and then headed back to wait for them to show up. But when we got there, we noticed that the inside of our car was now covered in mud and leaves. Truthfully, with all that was going on, I can't remember if we locked the door, but I suspect that we didn't. And whatever or whoever was out there in the woods had apparently rummaged through the car. We did an inventory check and nothing was taken, not even a laptop that was lying visibly in the back seat. A little freaked out at the moment, we quickly got into the car, locked the doors, and waited for help to arrive. We discussed what we thought had just happened. If it was a person, why didn't they steal anything? If it was a bear, why wasn't the car interior destroyed or any of the snacks taken? AAA eventually showed up and towed my car the full distance home. We never did figure it out. They haven't discussed the incident since then, but every time I drive through the mountains near where I live, I do think about it. As much as I'd love to have some answers, I'm glad that we didn't come face to face with what was out there that night. It was a wet spring day in Phoenix when my wife and I set out on a road trip to Nashville. We had been planning it for months, and we're both excited to explore a new city. My wife and I are big country music fans, and we're looking forward to the downtown music scene, and had tickets to the Country Music Hall of Fame. We even made reservations for a full day trip to Memphis to visit Graceland. Oh yeah, we were pretty excited. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and hit the road. We drove both during the day and night to make good time. We made several bathroom stops and finally a gas stop late one night. We were exhausted but knew we had to push through to make it to our destination. As we got ready to leave the gas station, an old woman dressed in a loose-fitting white gown and matching headdress came up to us and asked us for a ride. She said that she was needing to get home and that she lived 5 miles up the highway. My wife and I were hesitant, but despite her slightly bizarre wardrobe, the old woman looked frail and out of options. It would have bothered us to have left her all alone in the middle of the night to walk home. So we reluctantly agreed and let her in the back seat, and she thanked us. I asked her where exactly she was heading, but she just pointed to the highway entrance. As we got back onto the empty highway, I asked her again to please give me an exact location to where she needed to be dropped off. This time the woman made no gestures at all and gave us no verbal response either. And after a few awkward moments of silence, the woman started to speak out loud in some foreign language. We were both confused at first, but started to become alarmed as her tone became angry and aggressive. The woman suddenly held up a strange handmade ornament that looked religious in nature and pushed it into my wife's face while yelling at her in that weird language. My wife tried to ask her what she was doing, but she got no answer. I could feel my heart racing and my palms were getting sweaty as my stress level rose. After a minute of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, got out of the car, grabbed the woman, and threw her out of the car. The woman screamed at us and mentioned something about a curse. As she pulled away, her voice dropped off, and when we looked back, she was nowhere to be found. She just seemed to vanish into thin air. My wife and I were both shaken by the experience. We tried to rationalize what had just happened, but couldn't make any sense of it. We continued our road trip to Nashville, but we couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. It was a trip that we would never forget, and one that left us with more questions than answers. This happened to me 3 years ago now. I was driving a long way from Washington State to Nevada for my cousin's wedding. I was excited to see my family, but not so much to the long road trip. I had been driving for 10 hours at this point, with only 3 stops, 2 for gas and 1 for lunch. And things were going smoothly until the GPS took me down some desolate roads instead of the highway. I wasn't getting any cell service out here, but the GPS was working just fine. And this looked like a shortcut that would eventually lead me back to the highway, so I kept going. It was late at night now, and this road was totally empty the entire way so far. But then I passed a pickup truck parked on the side of the road with its lights turned off and seemingly nobody inside. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but I did make a mental note of it. About a mile later, disaster strike. My car tire blew out, and I had to pull over to change it. As I was in the process of changing the tire, I saw lights coming up the road. Maybe it was the pickup truck? Suddenly, an alarm went off in my head. I didn't want to confront whoever was in that pickup truck in the middle of nowhere at night. So I decided to jump back into my Jeep and keep going despite the tire. The pickup truck caught up to me and tailed me closely rather than passing me, which made me even feel more uneasy. I was going well below the speed limit due to my tire being blown, and yet that truck wouldn't pass, even though I was driving half on the left shoulder to give them room. At one point, they started honking their horn and flashing their brights in an attempt to get me to pull over, but I did my best to ignore them and kept driving. They followed me for at least 10 miles until I eventually made it back onto the highway, where the pickup truck finally passed me by. I saw 3 men all sitting in the front cabin who turned to look at me before they stepped on the gas and sped off and out of sight. I got to a 24-hour gas station, and under the bright lights, it was clear that the tire was shredded. I suspected that it had to be those men in the pickup truck who had set up some kind of a spike strip or other device to get me to pull over for the purposes of robbing me, or worse. I was pretty shaken up, but luckily only 1 tire was hit, so I was able to throw on the spare and keep going. I made it to the wedding without any further incident, but I couldn't help but feeling that I had narrowly escaped a really bad situation.